but not wielded yet. Thank you very much, David. In Berlin, Ralph Brinkhaus is a German MP in Angela Merkel's CDU party and sits in the Bundestag's Finance Committee. In Brussels, we're joined by Marta Andreasen, a UK Independence Party MEP. She was the first chief accountant at the European Commission. John Peet here is the Europe editor of the Economist magazine. And the Conservative MP Mark Reckless tabled a rebel amendment last month calling for the government to demand a real terms cut in the EU budget. Well, Mark Reckless, you wanted a real terms cut. Doesn't look like you're going to get it.
I think there's a chance we could get it. I mean, ultimately, there's not actually that much difference between a freeze and a small cut. And I think what Europe is now understanding is the strength of feeling in the UK. And our Parliament has voted that there will be a cut, and we have to have legislation to implement it. So if there's not, then Europe could be operating without a budget.
Ralph Brinkhaus, this is all about atmosphere, isn't it? Because countries all over the European Union are having to slash their budgets. EU citizens are facing horrific austerity in some countries. And yet it just looks like the EU is going merrily on, agreeing to increase its budget, perhaps.
Yes, it's very difficult to communicate this to the people within Europe, but there are strong particular interests within the countries. So, for example, in the peripherals, in the south of Europe, and even in the east of Europe, people are a lot of talking about subsidies coming from the European Union. We have this agriculture problem in France, and we have this third group consisting out of Germany, UK, Sweden and Netherlands, who really want to freeze or to cut the budget and who have good arguments for it. Yes,
but the problem is, if you're sitting in Greece and you're facing a huge austerity, you actually don't think the European Union is doing anything for you at all.
Yes, I think the European Union is doing a lot for Greece, and there are a lot of funds Greece could participate, and so I guess that the government there has a strong interest in a raise of the budget and not in a cut or a freeze.
John Peet, why do you think, I mean, it may not be the case, what David says tonight, there seems to be some kind of shift, but all too often it looks like Britain doesn't win the arguments.
Well, I think there are two reasons why Britain doesn't win the arguments. The most important reason is that they're not very good at seeking allies. And I'm afraid we've seen this before with David Cameron. His approach to most summits is to go in threatening to veto things. And if you threaten to veto things where you have to reach a compromise at the end, you're not going to be very popular.
Well, do you think it's just because you've got a second point to make, but just on that one, do you think it's because he's not very, very well versed in Europe? He doesn't quite understand the communication system?
Well, he's under pressure, frankly, from people like Mark Reckless. I mean, his party at home is telling him, please go in. Boris Johnson was urging him to veto things this week. He has a lot of pressure at home to go in like a champion and threaten to veto things. But in Brussels, going in with a threat to veto is not necessarily the best approach to a negotiation that requires a compromise at the end of the night.
Perhaps he's just not very good at doing Europe.
Well, ultimately, if David Cameron doesn't veto, it may be that Parliament vetoes, and I think the rest of the EU needs to understand that this country is fed up to the back teeth of the EU, paying all this money in, and if they want us to carry on paying anything into it, then they're going to have to actually get with it and make some savings.
Wielding the veto would presumably be counterproductive in your view.
Well, I mean, you have to remember, this has to be agreed unanimously by all member states and the European Parliament. Everybody has a veto in this game, and it's not necessarily helpful to start threatening to wield a veto before you've even sat down to negotiate. That's my point.
People ask the question, why are we part of a system where the budget can only go up, where most people get the money out, and it's us that's paying for so much of it?
I mean, my second point was just to say the difference is actually quite small. The budget is relatively small. The difference between the two sides is relatively small. Heads of government wouldn't argue about this sort of sum of money if they were debating a budget at home. So actually, they should realise they're not arguing about a huge amount of money.
But it's about politics and it's about principle and it's about saving face. Marta Andreasen, all we hear at the moment is about great stories about waste in the EU, kind of bizarre stories about disappearing sheep and so forth. But these stories are all at the margins, aren't they? I mean, in many ways, the waste is minimal.
Well, Cttee, the waste is very important because this is taxpayers' money. and for the 18th year in a row, the auditors have refused to clear the accounts, the budget of the European Union, which means they cannot say that actually the money was given to the right person for the right purpose. And this is very serious. You know, this is taxpayers' money. We cannot continue to allow the European Commission to give the money out without controlling how it is used. You know, Greece has received 60 billion euros in the last decade in structural funds. Where have these 60 billion gone? Spain has received 130 billion euros in structural funding. Where has these funds gone? I mean, this is serious because now we have a Europe in crisis. And 10 years ago, the Lisbon strategy was supposed to make Europe the most evolved economy, state of the art. And there we are, you know, in a deep crisis. So, of course, this waste or fraud, because there is fraud, is very important to consider.
Ralph Brinkhaus, that Europe constantly talks about, they're going to reform structures, reform strategy, and it's always for another day. There's no actual real impetus for reform.
No. There is an impetus for reforms. I guess what we have reached within the last 2 or 3 years is much. I guess even in Greece we have some progress, and we have a lot of progress in Portugal. We have a lot of progress in Ireland. But you have to keep in mind it's a system which consists out of compromises, and you have 27 partners at the table negotiating, and so a fast-moving progress in reforms is very difficult.
But it needs to reform the CAP, and at one point we had Herman Van Rompuy talking about Britain actually contributing to its own CAP agricultural rebate. I mean, that's been withdrawn from the table now, but people just see this as the most extraordinary type of accounting.
So I think that this agriculture question is a very special question. And what we have to keep in mind is that we have parts in Europe where people depend on the agriculture sector. It's a completely different situation to UK and to parts of Germany. And so in organizing this big compromise, we have also to spend money for this agriculture sector, unfortunately. But we have to organize a decline, and this will be the task of the summit.
Well, leaving the CAP aside, though that is obviously a very central part of this, the bigger question is, at what point does Britain decide the game's a bogey, perhaps it's time to leave?
I mean, I think most British people are in that position already. I mean, if you look at most of the polls, ignoring the don't knows, it's almost now 2 to 1 who actually want to leave the EU. And I think seeing what's happening with the budget and the sort of waste and disgraceful overspending there is by the civil servants, 1 in 6 of whom are paid essentially more than our Prime Minister when you take into account all their allowances. It just can't go on.
If there had been proper reform, I mean, it just seems like this unwieldy monster that can't be tamed. And it's become even more so in the last 10 years. If it isn't tamed, then people really are going to turn their backs on it.
Well, I think there is quite a lot of disillusion with the European Union, obviously, particularly in this country. But I do think that what they're talking about in Brussels doesn't really address the main question. I mean, David Cameron wants to defend the rebate. The French want to defend agriculture. The Germans want to hold the whole budget down. I think they should have a much more intelligent discussion about what the budget is for, what it is spent on.
Well,
it is not a growth-promoting budget. They're not spending enough on research and development. They shouldn't spend this much on agriculture. They should be looking for ways of boosting growth in Europe, which they're just not doing, and I think that would be a much more sensible use of their time.
Well, Ralph Brinkhaus, isn't the problem here, as we're saying, is that many people in Britain are disillusioned with the European Union? I mean, in your view, how damaging would it be to Europe if Britain decided to call it a day?
So it would be a big damage, and we really need Britain within the Eurozone, not in the Eurozone, in the European Union, sorry, and we need as Germans, as Britons, on our side. And so we have to organize a compromise. And in organizing a compromise, it's very bad to have a red line at the beginning of the negotiations. And what we expect is that we get an open negotiation, and Angela Merkel will do a lot to build a bridge for Britain and for France and for the other countries. And I guess at the end of the day, unfortunately not at the end of today, but of some days in the future, we will have this compromise in the budget. And the main question is not the budget. The main question is to reorganize the European Union, and for this process it would be a big damage if UK leaves.
Thank you all very much indeed.